Hey, everybody. On this week's episode of Tell Me More, we are taking one long conversation and breaking it up into 2 episodes. In the first episode, we'll talk about the cultural context of the book of Ruth, where it falls in the Old Testament, and what's going on in the people of God at that time. And the second part, we'll jump into the first chapter of Ruth. 2 really awesome episodes from one conversation, so make sure you listen to both. In this episode, we are talking about the cultural context. And if you didn't know, the Old Testament has some pretty graphic stories. We're going to get into one of those stories in this episode, so be mindful about where you're listening or who you've got in the car with you.
I mean, I think that we should just be honest and say that we chose Ruth because it was Mother's Day.
We did?
No, we didn't.
I don't remember that. That's not why I chose it.
It's not why you chose it?
I don't remember. I mean, I don't know that I chose it, but I don't remember that.
I'm completely kidding.
Okay, good.
I was like so quickly like, no.
No, I know we didn't do that. I'm a little bit surprised that you guys didn't know I was
I'm
sorry.
Joking. I didn't get the joke.
I'm sorry. That's because I'm such a good actress.
I mean, you said that.
We did start the book of Ruth, and it's something that we've been circling around for a while, actually. We've been kind of in conversations like, hey, we should do Ruth. Hey, we should do Ruth.
Yeah, we have had a couple conversations about it.
Yeah. And for one reason or another, we kind of put it on the back burner. But this time we came back around to it and we were like, I think this is...
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's go through Ruth.
Mm-hmm.
So, but what people typically think about Ruth is that it's a love story.
If they think about it.
If they think about it.
So I don't know. I mean, who knows about this book? Maybe you've read it. Maybe you haven't.
Yeah. And you can read it. It's very short.
Yeah. It is
so
short.
you could read it in 15 minutes and pat yourself on the back.
Yeah.
You
read
read
the whole book of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
It's like four chapters. And I think in if you do like the yearly reading plan or whatever, it's...
Do you read it all in one day?
A day of your 365, you know? Mm-hmm. And so it's easy to just kind of, honestly, forgettable.
Forgettable?
No, you know what I mean, though.
Okay. Yeah, I understand why you would say that.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't know how to read it or you don't,
yeah.
I mean, I'd read it many times. It had never really stood out much to me. I mean, I knew the story.
Yeah.
I knew what happened, but it didn't really... I mean, I was thinking about this weekend. This is definitely the first time I've ever preached, certainly preached through the book of Ruth, but referenced, like probably ever used a verse from Ruth. Because it's all narrative. So you don't...
Yeah.
It's not like it doesn't contain like thoughts that you could pull out and, apply in other situations.
Yeah. So if people are
or
reading...
At least that I knew it to do.
People are reading the book of Ruth, what do they think? Like, if you read through the 4 chapters of Ruth and you just kind of took it for face value, what would you think?
Well, I mean, you might think it's a love story between, like a romantic love story. I think that's one that does show up a bit.
You have to wait for your Boaz.
Yeah. I bet you that's been taught several times.
So many times, yeah.
Okay, so from a female perspective, is this something that you heard more like growing up? Because I never, I mean, I didn't pay attention.
Yeah. Like how you do this, you're waiting for a man of valor like Boaz, and how you go about, somebody who's going to take you into consideration, who's not going to
You're looking for your kinsman redeemer.
You are looking for that kinsman redeemer.
Even that's so untouchable. You're like, what does that even mean? Like, what are you talking about?
It can get a little weird, for sure. But you really do think that it is about Ruth finding the love of her life. And
Wow.
And he's wealthy.
And he's wealthy. And he's older. And for some reason unmarried. We don't know why. We don't know all that. But
no kidding.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thought I hadn't considered. Man, It's funny how we read our culture into all of this so quickly, so easily. And I can't blame. I would have done the same. I mean, it's easy to. But you come to stuff like this with your own cultural lens, and you don't realize it's not saying what you think it's saying at all. It's just so not about that.
It's so not about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about where Ruth is in the biblical story so that we can understand the setting here. And I like the way you did it this weekend,
cool.
too.
What service did you come to?
I went to Saturday night.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I listened to a little bit on Sunday, too.
I tweaked it a little bit from Sunday.
Some of it might be switched around a little bit.
So Ruth is the 8th book of the Bible. So if you're kind of working through it, you got Genesis, right? We kind of know what Genesis is, starts the whole story off, but also we get the beginnings of God's redemptive plan working through Abraham. We chart kind of what happens, the journey of this one family with God. And then Exodus, we kind of fast forward all this time, 400 years or so. And you have now this family is multiplied, but they're enslaved. And then obviously God brings them out through Moses.
Yeah.
Right? And then you get Leviticus, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. So Leviticus is essentially these like basically priestly commands. A lot of it is. It's a lot of
law.
Yeah, but rules and regulations gets thrown out a lot. But it's basically kind of the what would I say I'm looking for a word. I don't other than rules, but it's the customs, if you will, of how these people are going to interface with God and with each other.
Yeah, because at the center of the book of Leviticus is the Day of Atonement. So it is this kind of, how do you engage with
forming.
God?
It is rules, but it's also culture forming. Because, I mean, our culture is based on certain rules, norms, values that we just sort of take for granted or maybe even for truth. We just don't even consider this is just how things are. Then you get Numbers, which is I'm less familiar with that book, but it's largely what happens in Numbers. There's basically kind of they're wandering in the wilderness kind of thing.
And I think Balaam is in Numbers too. Yeah, like I think there's some stories, there's some wanderings that happen, but then there's
we probably should get more familiar with Numbers.
We should. Do we want to do a series through Numbers?
Maybe
next summer. Numbers,
and then it's Deuteronomy.
Yep.
Right. And this is kind of Moses, sort of the end of Moses.
Yeah, restating of kind of everything that was already said.
Right.
So.
And then it's Joshua, and then that's sort of the Canaanite conquest, if you will, like going into the land. And then it's Judges. So that Judges is the 7th book. And so basically Judges begins with after the death of Joshua. So you had this, it starts with this family, and then there's this kind of period where they're multiplying in Egypt, but they're enslaved. And then Moses comes along, used by God to deliver his people, pull them out of Egypt. They start forming together as a people. God gives them laws and customs and ritual for this is how you're going to interface with each other and with me. And then Moses dies just on the precipice of the promised land that they're heading to. And then Joshua is the one to lead them in. They fight all these great battles. They win. They're now in the land. And then Joshua dies. And then you have the time period of the Judges. So honestly, I don't know how long the time period of the Judges was.
Yeah.
That's something I didn't research for this weekend, but I'm curious.
Yeah.
So Joshua dies, and then there's basically these, they're called judges, but these different people, leaders of the people that just sort of rise up.
Yeah, and they rise up so based on the lament of the people.
Right.
Because after Joshua dies, it has this whole section about how Israel failed to kind of push everybody out of the land. And so the Canaanites stay in the land. They put them in like forced labor, basically. But the reality is that where God said, okay, this is a land I'm giving to you, everybody else leave, and you guys, and this is yours now, they kind of stopped a little bit short. And they said, hey, I don't think it's a problem that these people stay around and help out or whatever. And so you get a kind of infiltration of foreign gods within the kind of practices of Israel.
Yeah.
And so over time, what happens is other nations come in and try to take over. They get into battles. And when the people of Israel get desperate enough, they begin to cry out to God, and God says, okay, I'm going to raise up a judge.
Here's Gideon or Samson or Deborah or whomever. Yeah.
As you go through the book of Judges, you find that the judges themselves get a little bit more morally kind of questionable
as you go through.
So you find that there is this moral decline. So God is still faithful to raise up a judge for the people who are crying out to him. But he's like, guys, I don't have many more people to use on to deliver you from the mess that you're getting yourselves into. Right. So, and that's kind of where Ruth picks up, where there's just been a great moral decline.
So Judges ends with this crazy story. I haven't read it recently.
Oh yeah,
but the story of the concubine of that Levite, which
it's a terrible story, but it does give a really clear depiction of just how far the people of Israel have fallen away from what God would have desired of them, that he would have laid out.
So it starts in Judges 19. Yeah, I'm not even going to get into it. But if you want to read it, it's Judges 19 basically through 21 is kind of the ending of the book of Judges, and it's this really horrible ending where this,
It's, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so there is a Levite who has a concubine.
What's a Levite?
A Levite is one of
basically the priestly tribe.
Yeah. And he has a concubine. And so I think we should make a note about some of this cultural things that were true of this time.
Okay.
Like concubines.
Yeah, I was going to say.
When we
just
say,
got my concubine.
This isn't just a normal thing.
So he has a wife.
Yeah. Well, there's things that God made cultural allowances for. And does that make sense?
That he doesn't come right in and just stop straight away.
Yeah, that's my thought.
I mean, if you're going to Genesis 2, man shall leave his father and mother, shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. You get monogamy there, but somewhere in between then and let's say the time of Abraham, it's pretty well culturally normal for a man to also have a concubine, or maybe more than one concubine, which would be other women through which he's
able to have children.
Yeah, but and is that the goal?
Oh, 100%. Yes.
Children are the goal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So heirs, offspring. Interesting. You could imagine, just even going back 100, 200 years here in the United States, having a lot of kids is a good thing. You need help around the farm. Somebody's got to churn this butter.
That's right. Yeah, that's your economy.
Yeah,
and so we'll get into that.
Labor.
Yeah, we'll get into that in Ruth for sure.
Especially if we're living out in the middle of nowhere, right?
Yeah. So okay, but he does I see here that she's called the concubine, but then it says her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her. So she's unfaithful. She runs off to her father's house. He goes to get her back. And as he is coming back through, to bring her back home, they go through a town, the Benjaminite town.
Okay.
And the Benjaminites come out.
Of the tribe of Benjamin, right?
Yes.
Are they? That's crazy. Okay.
And he's going to stay in the middle of the square with his concubine. And a man comes and he goes, not a good idea. Come into my house, stay with me.
Right.
And then the dudes come and they
so hold up. Let's make sure we got all the, So Levite has his concubine, bringing her back. He's coming through a town square. He's going to just stay the night in the town square. But an old man from that town shows up and sees this guy. He's being hospitable. He says, hey, you shouldn't stay out here.
Yeah.
It's not going to be good. So the Levite and his concubine go to stay with the old man. And the men of the town, this sounds like a story from Genesis.
Yeah.
Remember when there's a couple of angels coming through a place called Sodom, and they go to stay with Lot, and the men of the town show up and start beating on the door, and that's fascinating too, because so Sodom is not God's people.
No. Right.
Those are not God's people. Abraham and his nephew Lot, specifically Abraham, but Lot, sort of by way of Abraham, has some at least connection to God's people, and so, or is one of God's people, if you will. But now this is God's people doing the same thing. So they come and what? They're beating on the door?
Yeah, it says in 22, as they were making their hearts merry, behold the men.
So they're getting drunk.
Yeah, behold the
And they're
men
like,
of
hey,
the city.
There's a guy over here we've never seen before. Let's go get him.
Yeah, worthless fellows is how it describes it. Surrounded the house, beating on the door, and they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house.
Gosh.
That we may know him. Yeah.
Ooh. This is a horrible story.
It is a horrible story.
If you have children in the car, now's probably the time you want to think about not listening to this. With them.
Yeah. Because, I mean, the Bible doesn't.
Yeah, it doesn't shy away from it.
Yeah. So it is actually.
It's hard to say.
Really heartbreaking what happens because they say instead of.
This is exactly what happens with Lot. He goes, well, here, take my daughters.
Yeah.
And they don't.
They don't. But this man
offers up the concubine. Who? The Levite or the old man? Who is it that offers up the concubine?
But the men would not listen to it. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them.
The Levite, oh my Lord.
Yeah. And
oh my Lord.
Yeah. And so
they do what you think they would do.
Yeah. And in the morning.
But to such a degree
that it kills her. That she dies.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the Levite is so mad that he cuts up the concubine into 12 pieces. I think it's 12.
Can you imagine that job?
Yep, into 12, and sent her throughout Israel. And he said, look at what these people have become. This is a sign of what the Benjaminites have become. And they are basically like disavowed from Israel. Yeah. They're cut off at that point. And so they go to war with them like, hey, this is not okay. But then the Benjaminites have no wives.
How did we get here?
So, it is crazy. So,
but isn't there 21, there a place where basically they're just like, hey, hold up a second. If we wipe these people out, it's going to be a real tragedy. They're part of our one of our tribes. We can't get rid of them.
Yeah.
Doesn't that happen?
So, in 20, maybe this is where it is. So in 21, now the men of Israel had sworn at Mizpah, no one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. And the people came to Bethel and sat there till evening before God. And they lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. And they said, O Lord, the God of Israel, why has this happened in Israel, that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel? Yeah.
So they really don't want that to happen.
They really don't. Yeah. And so
there's a strange story of where they find these lives.
It is such a weird story. But then they go and they attack a town.
Yeah.
And
so let me say this. I don't want to make excuses for what's happening here. Not at all.
No.
But I also think it's really important, and this is important as we read into Ruth as well. And this takes work for me, all of us. The world of the Bible is so foreign to us that I think there are things that it would almost be like traveling to another planet. The customs, the way of thinking about, we just can't even imagine how, because it's so radically different. The way they thought about family, the way they like even with concubines and all of this. So here's a good example of this, just to give you a case in point, going a little closer to like our own history. I read Luther's biography a couple years ago, or a Luther biography. There are many. One of the fascinating things, and you see this a little bit with kind of, it's the residue of the ancient world, but when Luther is married, and on the night of his wedding, I believe it is, and he and his wife are consummating their marriage, his best friend is in the room watching. And this is normal practice, right? So, and you got to say like, why? Well, and I don't honestly remember. That just stood out to me, as you can imagine,
as it should. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, and if I remember correctly, he wept. And so they clearly like, so our ideas of sex, our ideas of romance, our ideas of marriage, our ideas of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate in a relationship, what constitutes a sexual gesture or advance, and what does not, are just so radically different than the world of the past that I think what would be a real mistake is to just read into all of this kind of how we think about the world, and that somehow they just ignored all the things we kind of take for granted or just assume about the world that weren't necessarily assumed. And also the way they thought about family or women. Yeah. How they considered like where they position women within the whole of the like the hierarchy
like
of value.
Hierarchy, yeah.
Yeah. Be like, man, I don't know how it works. Woman is somewhere lower down the scale, right?
Yeah.
And it was and you could say it's been Christianity that has elevated the status of women wherever it has gone. But anyway, that's the I think it's important because you'll read this and think a lot of things, I guess not only will it not make any sense, but I think you could actually misinterpret too what's happening because you'll be looking at it through the same lens as, and that ultimately that's what we're talking about with Ruth. Like that's why we read romance into Ruth, is because that's the way we see the world. And typically when there's a guy and a girl in a story and they're going to end up together, the only way we even know to look at a story like that is through the lens of romance, because that's the way we've all been raised.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think that's important. I'm curious, do we have any resources? Like what might we, if someone said, I want to know about that. Like I want to know about like the culture of the Bible.
I think that Sandra Richter she has some fantastic.
So the Epic of Eden, would you recommend, or is it another book?
Yeah. I haven't read Epic of Eden.
I own it, but I haven't read it. I've read a couple paragraphs, honestly.
Yeah. And then I think, would you recommend Misreading Scripture?
I totally would recommend. So there's a book called Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes, something like that. I'm probably
I've read it. I've read some of it too. It's helpful. Yeah, but I would say specifically around like, is the Bible and the Old Testament degrading to women?
Sandra
Richter is probably the best person for that, and she has a really helpful biblical approach to actually kind of elevating or
showing
understanding
how the law of the Old Testament actually elevated women instead of...
Because when you read this and you read how the people of God are acting here, you're like, awful. Wait a second, why would I want to have anything to do with what this is be associated with this in any way? And so I think
and I think another thing too that's really helpful to understand, it's something I talked about and it can be really confusing, especially in a place like this. I talked about it this weekend, is the idea that the Bible shows as much as or more than it tells. And so there are times when you read something like this, and because God doesn't show up and say, these evil Benjaminites or whatever, Benjaminites, then we just assume he was okay with it, or because God doesn't tell Abraham, have no concubine, we just think he's okay with it. But reading through the scripture, you're meant to read between the lines and go, well, how did that work out for them?
Yeah.
And when you look at it in light of that kind of, it wasn't good. So this is so the judges in it basically rubber stamping everything that happened in those days, or even things that God remained silent about. And by the way, like that's the world that we live in too, is a world where, in some sense, you could say God remains silent about certain evils, in that insofar as they happen, right? God is not out there putting a total stop to all evil, the evil that we wish that he would put, a complete stop to. It doesn't happen. It's there. And so you have to kind of grapple with that. The Bible doesn't shy away from that tension at all. So anyway, just a couple thoughts about kind of context and how we read this.
Yeah. And to wrap this up, put a bow on it, what happens is they send the Benjaminites to go, I think it's Jabesh Gilead, and to just, get some virgins.
Yeah, just find some, just go capture them.
Yeah.
Kind of caveman style, just hit them on the head and just drag them.
Exactly.
Pretty much.
Not ideal at all, but
This is the climate where Ruth and Naomi find themselves without
and they're going to find themselves alone too.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Now you have to wonder, like, what I don't know is how and this would be curious, like, how did women think about this at that time? I get it. Like was this like to be taken by a man that you didn't know, right? Like these Benjaminites coming in your tribe. Is this a please forgive the audacity of the question, but I do wonder, like, culturally speaking, is it an audacious thing? Is it terrible? Is it traumatic for you? And
I would say
it would be traumatic for us now.
Well, I think of course it would be traumatic, but it would also be unfortunately normal.
Yeah. Okay.
So
right.
like you can't
to be
not outside the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
I think that the time of the judges took place in the Iron Age.
Okay.
I think if you were to try and figure that out, we might have to look at other writings. Did anyone ever talk about how a woman felt in that time?
Probably not.
Probably not. Because they were on the level of like a slave or
That's wild. Yeah. So that is the context into which Ruth Naomi and Ruth's story. So that's an interesting thing too, as we get into it, is we're going to find that the story of Ruth isn't really just about Ruth. In fact, it doesn't begin with Ruth and it doesn't end with Ruth. It really starts with Naomi and Naomi's story and their family story. It's
wild with you guys going through all of that. Like, the stakes are really high in this first chapter.
I wish I could have gotten into all of that this weekend. There's just like, there was not enough time for me to talk about what I needed to talk about as it was.
Yeah.
But it's a wild story.
Thankfully, we have a podcast.
Yeah, where we can talk about this stuff. It's true.
Yeah. So just before we jump in, verse 25 of Judges 21.
Very, very helpful.
In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Yeah.
So that was a big kind of like, that was something that you pulled out this weekend. Do you want to talk some more about that?
Sure. I mean, it's a time of chaos. In some sense, you could call it anarchy. I mean, that's literally what's being described. Everyone doing what's right in their own eyes. And so, so you have this kind of, but I also think the language is telling there was no king in Israel. Everyone does what's right in his eyes. The book after Ruth is 1 Samuel, where we get the last of the judges, Samuel, the prophet, who would first anoint Saul as king, but then later David. And David, of course, is the kind of prototypical, when you think of kings of Israel, it's David is the guy. He's the one held up as sort of the, I don't know what I would say. Maybe the ideal king, or at least the closest to the ideal that Israel ever had, which is crazy when you think about it. It goes Saul, it goes David, it goes Solomon, and then it goes off the rails.
It really, really
does. And I bet you
does.
Can't name too many kings after. I mean, you might be able to get some like bad ones like Ahab.
Yeah.
But like it's just a bunch of terrible people after that. Like pretty much.
They're not all.
There's a couple of okay guys in there.
You get Josiah
Yeah.
towards the end
Yeah.
who really like kind of wants
best.
to pull people back to the Lord, and the Lord says, okay, well, for your lifetime you won't experience, but there's been so much sin that these people they're going to go into captivity. This is what's going to happen. And so he gets a little bit of peace, but
I mean, so it is essentially right on the heels of Solomon that after Solomon's death, that the kingdom fractures into two.
Yeah.
There's a northern and a southern, and it never is to be repaired. I mean, literally what happens is you have Solomon, kingdom fractures in two. They actually fight with each other at different times.
Yeah.
They're not, the vast majority of the kings are not good. Reading through First and Second Chronicles or First and Second Kings, were probably both of them because they both kind of detail Israel's history through there. You just keep reading about, if you've been read through the Bible in a year or whatever, this king was terrible and this king was terrible. And they're just all pretty much terrible. There's a couple of good ones in there. And then they go into captivity, each at a different time. I can't remember which goes first, northern or southern, but they go into different captivities. And then they come back after exile from Persia.
yeah. Well,
That's Nehemiah.
yes. Yeah.
And Ezra, Nehemiah. And then it's Rome eventually comes in. So, actually, the Greeks, so it's Alexander the Great, then Rome, and then it's Jesus. So they really don't have, my point in telling this kind of overview of Israel's history, light overview, is that they really never have, like their glory days are really short.
They are.
If you were thinking about like a couple thousand years or more of history, and you got a 40-year period where it was or let's call it 80, David and Solomon. Let's just say those were the good old days. You had 80 years. And even Solomon had some, his heart turned away from the Lord for a while. And so, it's the idea is that, so there's this king coming. This is what I think is fascinating. It's like this pointing to a king. Now, there's also this detail, and I didn't have time to get into it this weekend, but it's the allowance that God makes for their wanting. They wanted a king. It says they wanted to be like the other nations. And so God gives them a king. And we talked about this prior to the sermon this week, or last week, is you'd mentioned, so God makes this allowance for them to have a king, but it wasn't really his ideal. He wanted to be their king.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he gives them these kings, but they're flawed, and it doesn't ultimately work out because his ultimate desire is for him to be their king.
Yeah.
And of course, that is what happens when Jesus was crucified. Above his head hung a sign that said, King of the Jews. And so, I mean, and that's what we call him, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Like he is the king. And when he finally showed up, they crucified him. Kind of wild.
Yeah.
But that's the story of the Old Testament. I talked about this on Sunday a bit more. Story of the Old Testament points to Jesus. The story of the New Testament basically reflects back on Jesus and looks forward to his second coming. But I mean, that's,
Yeah.
So Jesus, center point, he's the king that they've been looking for. So you get a little bit of that foreshadowing all the way back in Judges. There's no king. And we need a king.
Yeah.
We really need a king. But then the ones that we come up with aren't great.
They're not great. Yeah. And some of that is God allowing them to experience what is the hardships of having a human king. That's not him. And so I think it's really interesting that they're like, we want a king like the nations, and Jesus is the King of Kings, but he's the exact opposite of what a king like the nations would have been.
Yeah.
So
you get those allusions. The end of the book of Ruth ends with her and Boaz having a son. They name him Obed. He's the father of Jesse, father of David. It's all of this ooh, there's a king coming.
Yeah.
Someone good's coming. Again, this is the kind of the anticipatory nature of the Old Testament, beginning with even Genesis 3, where there's sin. It's the foreshadowing of Christ.
Yeah.
You see it all the way through.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Jesus kind of makes that pretty clear at different points. I'm thinking of Luke 24, when he takes his disciples on the road to Emmaus back to the scriptures, the Old Testament. hey, this is all pointing to me. And it is.
Yeah,
And it is. So that's kind of what we're meant to read into all of this. What are you thinking?
I just think that it adds so much depth and beauty to the way that you would engage with the story of Ruth.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't simply read it as a love story
Right.
Between a man and a woman. But
Right. There's so much more to it.
Yeah, you're bringing this kind of hope to the story now, that a hope that's not just for the people of Israel, but that's for us today.
I like, that's exactly right, because Ruth takes place in a time when, so both culturally broken, nationally broken, right? It's not good. But even personally broken. And there's redemption at all of the levels to some degree, not the full totality. I mean, I think David was God's gift to his people too. Like, I truly believe that. Like, I think God sends imperfect people, even though they're not perfect. It's better than what it would have been had David never showed up. I mean, that's a gift of God's grace.
Yeah, and I think the descriptor of David as a man after God's own heart is an indicator of the kind of man that God can use.
Yeah.
And so, even though he, imperfect as he may be, what God can do with people who are like set towards him and his ways is far more expansive than, him just using anyone off the street, I guess. But what I think is really interesting about the book of Ruth, and what I love about it is that God uses really unexpected people to bring about his plan of redemption and his glory. And I know that we'll get into that in future episodes, but
I wish I could.
Woman?
There's just so much to this whole story. And there were so many themes that could have been taught out of week 1, and you just don't have the time to hit. That's the whole Ruth being a Moabite. She's an outsider. I mean, I barely even scratched the surface of that whole idea that God would use. And she shows up in the genealogy of Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, we're one of 2. At least I think it's just 2.
Yeah.
Rahab being the other.
Yeah. And then there's Tamar, who has her own checkered history. So, okay. Should we dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay.